June 6th, 1944. Southern England, before dawn. The room is dim, lit by a single shaded lamp. Maps cover the walls, their surfaces crowded with pins, lines, and penciled timings that represent the largest amphibious assault in history. Dwight D. Eisenhower stands quietly at the edge of the room, hands resting on the back of a chair. He has not slept. Across the channel, thousands of men are already moving toward the coast of France. Some are landing, some are still in the water, others will not make it at all. Reports arrive in fragments, partial, delayed, uncertain. One sector in particular draws attention: Juno Beach. Assigned to Canadian forces, it was expected to be among the most difficult landings of the day. Strong German defenses, limited exits, a narrow strip of sand that would offer little forgiveness if the assault stalled. Eisenhower waits for confirmation, not of victory, but of survival. When the message finally comes, it is brief, measured, almost understated. The Canadians have not only landed, they have cleared the beachhead faster than planned. Casualties are heavy, but objectives are met. Movement inland has begun. Eisenhower does not speak at first. Then, quietly, so quietly it barely carries beyond the room, he responds. To understand why that moment mattered, we have to step back to what Juno Beach represented and what success there meant on the morning of June 6th. Juno Beach was never meant to be easy. Stretching between the British sectors of Gold and Sword, the Canadian landing zone covered a series of small seaside towns: Courseulles-sur-Mer, Bernières-sur-Mer, and Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. These were not open beaches. They were built-up areas, reinforced with concrete, seawalls, and interlocking fields of fire designed to break an assault before it could move inland. German planners understood the value of this stretch of coast. It guarded direct routes toward Caen and the road network beyond. If the Allies failed here, the entire eastern flank of the invasion would be exposed. If they succeeded too slowly, neighboring beaches could be rolled up from the side. Canadian forces assigned to Juno were experienced, but realistic. The 3rd Canadian Infantry Division and 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade had trained extensively in amphibious operations, yet Normandy presented conditions no exercise could fully replicate. Tides were high, weather was marginal, intelligence on German strength was incomplete. The defenders belonged largely to the German 716th Infantry Division, reinforced in places by elements of the 21st Panzer Division. While some units were under strength, their positions were well prepared. Concrete bunkers housed machine guns and artillery pieces calibrated for the beach approaches. Obstacles, steel hedgehogs, wooden stakes, and mines were arranged to tear apart landing craft and delay armor. Canadian planners knew the timetable was unforgiving. Delays on the sand would compress troops into lethal zones. Every minute lost increased exposure to fire and the risk of counterattack. The first waves would absorb the worst of it, and success depended on immediate follow-on movement. At Supreme Headquarters, Eisenhower understood this better than anyone. He had read casualty estimates that reached into the thousands. He had signed a contingency statement, accepting full responsibility if the landings failed. Juno Beach was one of the sectors that worried him most, not because of Canadian capability, but because of geography and timing. As the invasion began, communication gaps widened. Reports arrived late or not at all. For hours, Eisenhower and his staff could only interpret silence. And on Juno Beach, that silence hid a fight unfolding faster and more violently than expected. The Canadian assault began under conditions that immediately disrupted the plan. Rough seas delayed the first waves, compressing landings into a narrower window than intended. When the infantry finally hit the beaches, German defenders were fully alert. Machine gun fire swept the sand. Mortars and artillery zeroed in on exits that had been identified during planning but not fully neutralized. Casualties mounted quickly. In some companies, nearly half the men became casualties within minutes. Tanks meant to provide immediate fire support were delayed by obstacles and waterlogged approaches. For a brief, critical period, Canadian infantry advanced without armored cover, forced to clear fortified positions with small arms, grenades, and sheer momentum. What followed was not a breakthrough driven by speed, but by persistence. Assault teams isolated bunkers rather than attempting to overrun them head-on. Engineers cleared gaps through seawalls under fire. Communications were re-established piecemeal as units pushed forward beyond the shoreline. Despite delays, something unexpected happened. Once the first line of defenses was breached, Canadian units did not pause. Instead of consolidating on the beach as doctrine suggested, they pushed inland aggressively, exploiting gaps before German reserves could respond. By late morning, elements of the 3rd Canadian Division had advanced farther inland than any other Allied formation that day. Key road junctions were secured. German counterattacks were disrupted before they could fully form. At SHEF, information began to clarify. Juno was not stalled, it was moving, faster than planned. For Eisenhower, this presented a rare sensation on June 6th, cautious relief. The moment when that relief found words would come only after the full weight of the morning settled in. Canadian success at Juno did not come from flawless execution, it came from adaptation. Units landed late, scattered, and under intense fire. Command structures fractured almost immediately as officers were wounded or killed, yet small groups continued to move forward, guided by training rather than orders. Platoons advanced through beachfront towns room by room, bypassing strongpoints when possible and marking them for follow-up units. This refusal to stall on the sand prevented German defenders from resetting their fire plans. Momentum, once gained, was never surrendered. When Canadian armor finally arrived, it arrived into chaos. Shermans from the 2nd Canadian Armored Brigade pushed through obstacles still under fire, immediately engaging bunkers and inland positions. Their presence shifted the balance, allowing infantry to move faster and farther than anticipated. Armor was not used recklessly. Tanks supported advances in short bounds, firing only when necessary to avoid drawing unnecessary attention. This coordination limited losses while accelerating progress inland. German defenses at Juno were designed to destroy an assault before it could reorganize. What they were not designed for was an enemy willing to absorb initial losses and continue forward without pause. The speed of the Canadian advance disrupted planned counterattacks and fractured communication between German units. By the time higher command realized the beachhead was compromised, the opportunity to contain it had already passed. While Canadian units fought forward through smoke and rubble, the weight of the operation pressed down on command centers across southern England. Eisenhower's responsibility was not tactical control, but consequence. Every report carried implications far beyond one beach. A stalled landing at Juno would expose the British flank. A breakthrough could accelerate the entire eastern advance. Eisenhower understood that success on D-Day would not be measured by heroism alone, but by timing. Hours mattered. German reserves, particularly armored formations, could still be committed if the Allies hesitated. The early uncertainty surrounding Juno created tension not because of doubt in Canadian ability, but because of how little margin for error remained. Canadian soldiers carried an unspoken awareness that their sector mattered disproportionately. Juno was not Omaha, but it was not meant to fail quietly either. Many of the men advancing inland had already fought in earlier campaigns. They understood the cost of hesitation. What unfolded was not reckless courage, but determination shaped by experience. Losses were accepted as tragic, but not paralyzing. Units continued to advance because stopping would only make those losses meaningless. By pushing inland faster than expected, Canadian forces disrupted German assumptions about Allied intentions. Counterattacks that were planned for later in the day arrived too late or met prepared defenses. Roads that should have been denied to the Allies were already in use. This altered the rhythm of the entire eastern flank. British forces on Sword benefited from reduced pressure. German coordination weakened. The invasion, fragile in its first hours, began to harden into permanence. And it was at this point, when uncertainty gave way to confirmation, that Eisenhower finally received the report that would stay with him. The report reached Eisenhower in stages. At first, it was fragmentary. Canadian units ashore, resistance heavy, progress uneven, nothing unexpected. Similar messages arrived from every sector.
D-Day was unfolding as anticipated, violently, imperfectly, at great cost. Then, the tone began to change. Updated signals from Juno indicated that beach exits were open. Strongpoints were being bypassed or neutralized. Engineers were clearing routes inland faster than scheduled. Armor, once delayed, was now moving forward in support of advancing infantry. By mid-morning, the picture sharpened. Canadian elements had reached their initial inland objectives. Some had gone beyond them. Contact with neighboring British units was being established. German counterattacks were forming, but too late to push the Canadians back into the sea. For Eisenhower, this information cut through hours of uncertainty. Juno Beach had been expected to be dangerous, possibly slow. Instead, it had become one of the most rapidly secured beachheads of the day. The achievement was not bloodless. Casualty reports were sobering. Entire companies had been reduced, but the line held, and more importantly, it moved forward. Eisenhower understood what that meant. A secure Juno Beach closed a gap that German planners hoped to exploit. It stabilized the center of the Allied landings and reduced pressure on both flanks. When the confirmation was complete, Eisenhower stood quietly, absorbing the weight of it. There was no applause, no celebration, just a brief moment where expectation gave way to relief.
It was in that moment, after the reports had settled into clarity, that Eisenhower reacted. Those nearby later recalled that he did not raise his voice. There was no dramatic statement, no declaration of triumph. He leaned slightly forward, studying the map one more time, tracing the Canadian advance inland with his eyes. Then he spoke quietly, not to announce victory, but to acknowledge it. Accounts vary in wording, but the meaning was consistent. Eisenhower expressed relief, respect, a recognition that the Canadians had done more than was asked of them under conditions that offered little margin for success. His words were not meant for record or repetition. They were meant to release tension held since before dawn. In private correspondence and later reflections, Eisenhower would often emphasize restraint when discussing D-Day. He avoided dramatizing single moments, aware of how easily history could oversimplify. Yet he consistently noted the performance of Canadian forces at Juno as disciplined, determined, and decisive. That quiet reaction mattered because it reflected Eisenhower's role that day. He was not commanding from the front. He was carrying the burden of consequence, knowing that every success reduced the chance of catastrophic failure elsewhere. The Canadians' rapid clearance of Juno did not guarantee victory in Normandy, but it closed one door the Germans needed open. It bought time. It shifted balance. And for the first time that morning, Eisenhower allowed himself a moment of guarded confidence. The invasion was holding. By the afternoon of June 6th, Juno Beach no longer resembled a landing zone. The shoreline was crowded with damaged landing craft, discarded equipment, and the wounded being evacuated under fire. But beyond the sand, the Canadian bridgehead was intact and expanding. Units pushed deeper inland, securing villages and road junctions that planners had hoped to reach only later in the day. German attempts to contain the advance were fragmented. Counterattacks lacked coordination and arrived piecemeal, often colliding with Canadian positions that were already dug in and supported by armor. The cost was real. Nearly 1,000 Canadian soldiers were killed, wounded, or missing on D-Day. Many of the heaviest losses occurred in the opening hours, when infantry faced intact defenses without full armored support. Yet those losses did not halt the advance. They hardened it. At Supreme Headquarters, Juno's success began to influence broader decisions. With the Canadian sector secure, attention shifted to reinforcing and linking the beaches into a continuous front. Resources that might have been diverted to stabilize a faltering landing were freed for exploitation elsewhere. For Eisenhower, the emotional weight of the day did not lift. Reports from other beaches, especially Omaha, remained grim. But Juno stood as proof that the invasion could succeed under fire, that preparation and determination could overcome even well-prepared defenses. The Canadians did not pause to absorb that recognition. Their role in Normandy was only beginning. The
The question that followed was not how they had landed, but what their success now made possible.
In the days after D-Day, the significance of Juno Beach became clearer. Canadian forces continued to push toward Caen, absorbing the brunt of German counterattacks aimed at breaking the eastern flank of the Allied lodgment. The speed of the initial landing had denied the Germans time they desperately needed to organize a coherent response. The beachhead's rapid clearance allowed a steady flow of reinforcements, vehicles, and supplies to move inland. Roads that might have remained under fire were secured early. This logistical momentum proved critical as the campaign shifted from survival to expansion. Eisenhower, careful with public statements, praised the Allied effort as a whole, but in internal assessments, Canadian performance at Juno was noted as exceeding expectations, not because it was flawless, but because it adapted faster than the enemy could react. The whispered moment on June 6th was never meant to be quoted or preserved. It mattered because it revealed the human side of command at the highest level, a release of tension, a recognition earned under fire rather than declared. For the Canadians who fought through surf, smoke, and concrete, that acknowledgement changed nothing about the losses they carried forward. They continued fighting through Normandy, the Scheldt, and into the Netherlands, paying a high price long after the beaches were secured. Juno was not an ending. It was the beginning of a long, costly advance, one made possible by hours of discipline on a narrow strip of sand.
Leadership in war is often imagined as command given loudly and followed immediately. In reality, it is more often defined by waiting, by carrying responsibility in silence while outcomes remain uncertain. On June 6, 1944, Eisenhower waited while thousands of men fought beyond his reach. When word came that Canadian forces had cleared Juno Beach in record time, his reaction was not theatrical. It was restrained, almost private. A moment of relief earned by others. The Canadians did not achieve success through luck or spectacle. They did it by absorbing loss without surrendering momentum, by adapting faster than defenses built to stop them, and by pushing forward when doctrine might have suggested consolidation. That achievement did not shorten the war overnight, but it closed a door the enemy needed open. It stabilized a fragile invasion at its most dangerous hour. History often remembers speeches and declarations. Less often does it remember the quiet moments when those responsible finally allow themselves to breathe. The whisper mattered because it marked the instant when uncertainty began to fade, when the invasion was no longer a gamble but a foothold. And from that foothold, the war in Western Europe would move inexorably forward.